Maddox Jolie grew up in a world where becoming famous would have been almost effortless. His mother was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. His father was one of the most recognizable actors on the planet. And from childhood, cameras were already waiting for him. But Maddox took a very different route. Instead of chasing the spotlight, he went behind it. And what makes his story interesting is that he didn't suddenly become a filmmaker. He started much earlier, learning, watching, working, and slowly discovering how a film set actually operates. His first behind-the-scenes experiences came when he was still very young. Then, in 2017, he received an executive producer credit on First They Killed My Father, a film that had an especially personal connection to him because he was born in Cambodia. Years later, he returned to film production in a much more hands-on role. On Maria, he worked as a production assistant. On Without Blood, he worked in their assistant director department. And then came Couture, a film starring his mother. But this time, Maddox was simply another famous family member visiting the set. He was credited as a third assistant director. And the public-facing credits and production materials used a name that caught attention. Maddox Jolie, not Maddox Jolie-Pitt. That detail created headlines. But the name isn't actually the most interesting part of the story. The bigger story is what the credits reveal. Because over the years, Maddox has quietly moved deeper into professional film production. From trainee to production to assistant directing, he has been learning the business from inside the crew. So how did the son of two Hollywood superstars end up choosing a career that most audiences barely notice? And where could this path eventually take him? Because Maddox may not be trying to become the next Hollywood celebrity. He may be building something much quieter, a career of his own. Before Maddox appeared in serious film credits, he was simply growing up inside an extraordinary family. Movie sets were already part of his childhood. His mother directed films. His father starred in them. And the family often moved between Hollywood events, international travel, and film productions. But Maddox's relationship with filmmaking eventually became more than simply being around his parents' work. He began learning what happened behind the camera. On By the Sea, the 2015 film directed by Angelina Jolie and starring both of his parents, Maddox worked on the crew as a trainee. He wasn't the face of the movie. He was learning from the people making it. That distinction would become important, because being famous and understanding filmmaking are two completely different things. A film set isn't just actors standing in front of cameras. It is schedules, departments, equipment, communication, preparation, and hundreds of small decisions that have to happen at exactly the right time. Maddox was beginning to see that world from their inside. Then came First They Killed My Father. And this project was different. The story was set in Cambodia, the country where Maddox was born. It was based on Laung Ung's memoir about surviving the Khmer Rouge regime. And Maddox was simply watching his mother make the film. He became involved in the production. He was credited as an executive producer. Angelina Jolie later explained that Maddox read drafts, gave comments, attended production meetings, and became deeply involved in the process. For someone so young, it was a remarkable introduction to filmmaking. But perhaps the most interesting part is what happened afterward. Maddox didn't simply hold onto an impressive credit. Years later, he returned to the film business in a much more hands-on position. On Maria, he worked as a production assistant. That may sound less impressive than executive producer. But in many ways, it tells us more about the direction of his career. Because now he was learning the production process from inside the crew. Not just discussing the film. Not just receiving a credit. Actually working on the set. And that would lead to the next stage of his journey. Maddox was no longer simply the famous son visiting a movie set. He was becoming part of the crew. There is a big difference between being around a movie set and actually learning how a movie is made. Maddox's career shows that difference. His path has not been a simple jump from celebrity child to filmmaker. Instead, he has moved through different parts of production. He started young. He gained experience. And then he took on more responsibility. By the time he worked on Maria, he had already spent years around filmmaking. But Maria gave him a more practical role. He worked as a production assistant. It is not a glamorous Hollywood title. Most moviegoers would never recognize the people doing that job. But production assistants see how their entire machine works. They are around the departments. They see how people communicate. They learn how schedules affect the crew. They see what happens when something goes wrong. And they learn how much work exists between a script and the final image on screen. That kind of experience cannot be learned simply by being famous. It has to be learned by being there. Then came another important chapter. Without Blood, Angelina Jolie directed the film, and her sons Maddox and Pax worked behind the scenes in their assistant director department. Salma Hayek later praised the brothers for taking their responsibilities seriously and earning the respect of the crew. That detail matters, because it shows that Maddox's involvement was not simply about appearing on his mother's set. He was working, he was learning, and he was being evaluated by the people around him. Then came Couture, and this time the credit was different again. Maddox was listed as a third assistant director. That was a more defined position within their assistant director department. And suddenly, his career began to look less like a collection of celebrity appearances, and more like a developing resume. By this point, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Trainee, executive producer, production assistant, assistant director department, third assistant director. The titles do not form a perfectly traditional career ladder, but they do show one consistent direction. Maddox keeps returning to filmmaking. And more importantly, he keeps working behind the camera. That is the part of his story that deserves attention. Not because it guarantees that he will become a famous director. It doesn't. But because the work itself shows that he is gaining experience. Project by project. And now he has reached a point where the question is no longer whether Maddox is interested in filmmaking. The question is how far he wants to take it. There is a moment in any career when learning starts to become responsibility. For Maddox, that transition appears to have happened gradually. His experience on Maria placed him inside the production team. His work on Without Blood placed him in their assistant director department. And then Couture gave him another step forward. Third assistant director. It is important to understand what that means. An assistant director is not simply someone who helps the director. The department helps organize the practical side of a production. Schedules, communication, coordination, timing, keeping departments aligned, making sure the day's work can actually happen. It is one of the parts of filmmaking that audiences rarely think about. But without that coordination, the production can quickly fall apart. For Maddox, working in that environment meant learning something very different from acting. He was being asked to perform. He was being asked to work. And that difference is important, because a famous surname can introduce someone to an industry. It cannot automatically teach them how a professional film set operates. That comes with experience. On Without Blood, people who worked around Maddox and Pax noticed that they were serious about their responsibilities. Then on Couture, Maddox took another step into their assistant director department. And the credit became newsworthy for another reason. The film's public-facing materials used the name Maddox Jolie. That was different from his previous credit on Maria, where he appeared as Maddox Jolie-Pitt. Some databases have continued to list his full surname. But the public credits and production materials for Couture used Maddox Jolie. We don't need to guess what that means personally. We don't know his private reasoning. What we can observe is the professional progression. A young man who once appeared in headlines because of his parents was now appearing in film credits because of the work he was doing. And that is a very different kind of attention. The more important story isn't the surname. It is the job. Maddox was taking on responsibility inside a professional film crew. And that raises a much more interesting question. Why does someone with every opportunity to stand in front of the camera keep choosing the side of filmmaking that most people never see? There is something unusual about Maddox's career. He was born into a family where becoming famous was almost unavoidable. But his professional path has repeatedly taken him in the opposite direction. Behind the camera, inside production, within that crew, that doesn't mean we know that Maddox dislikes fame. We don't. It doesn't mean he has rejected Hollywood. He clearly hasn't. His career is happening inside the film industry. But his choices do reveal something interesting. He seems to be gaining experience in the parts of filmmaking that audiences rarely notice. That matters because filmmaking is much bigger than the people whose names appear on posters. There are production teams, assistant directors, camera departments, art departments, costume departments, sound crews, editors, and countless other people whose work disappears into the final credits. The audience sees the finished story. The crew sees everything that had to happen before the story could exist. Maddox has now experienced that world across several productions. He worked as a trainee. He received an executive producer credit. He worked as a production assistant. He worked in the assistant director department. And he became a third assistant director on Couture. That is a very different journey from simply becoming a celebrity. And perhaps that is why his story is worth following. Because a famous family can provide access. But access isn't the same as experience. And experience isn't the same as a career. Maddox is still building that career. We shouldn't exaggerate it. We shouldn't call him a major Hollywood filmmaker yet. He hasn't reached that point. But we can say something much simpler. He is accumulating experience. And he keeps choosing to return to the set. That may eventually become more important than any single credit. Because careers are rarely built in one dramatic moment. They are built through repetition, learning, mistakes, new responsibilities, and time. Maddox has already spent years moving through that process. And now comes the part nobody can predict. Where does he go next? Does he eventually move into producing? Does he become a director? Does he remain in assistant directing? Or does he discover an entirely different role within the industry? The truth is, we don't know. And perhaps that's exactly what makes the next chapter interesting. So where does Maddox go from here? That may be the most interesting question in his story. Because his career is no longer just about being around famous people. There is now a resume behind it. A trainee credit. An executive producer credit. Production experience. Assistant director work. And a third assistant director credit on Couture. None of that tells us exactly what Maddox will become. And we shouldn't pretend that it does. Maybe he will eventually direct. Maybe he will produce. Maybe he will continue working in assistant directing. Maybe he will find another part of filmmaking that suits him better. There are still many possibilities. But one thing is already clear. Maddox has repeatedly chosen to learn the industry from the inside. And that matters. Because he could have built a public career around being the son of Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. Instead, his professional resume is gradually becoming its own story. His family name may have opened the first door. But every new production requires him to show up and do the work. And that distinction is important. The world may always know him as Angelina Jolie's son. That part of his story will never disappear. But there is another story developing alongside it. The story of a young man learning how films are actually made. Not from the red carpet, not from the spotlight, but from their crew, from production, from long days on set, from responsibilities most audiences never see. And perhaps one day, that experience will lead somewhere much bigger. Maybe Maddox will eventually sit in the director's chair. Maybe he will produce films of his own. Or maybe his greatest contribution will happen somewhere the audience never notices. We simply don't know yet. But perhaps that's the point. Maddox doesn't need to have the ending writ already. He is still building the story. The world first knew him because of the family he was born into. Now slowly, his professional choices are giving people another reason to remember his name. Not just as Angelina Jolie's son, not just as Brad Pitt's son, but as Maddox, a person learning the business, a person building experience, and potentially, a filmmaker creating a future that belongs entirely to him. The spotlight may have introduced Maddox to Hollywood, but what he does behind the camera will determine where he goes next.